Good morning to Mr. Biddle's AP Human Geography class. Class, here we are, day 2 of Urban Development of Chapter 13. Today, your content objective, compare and contrast the concentric zone model, multi-nuclei model, and sector model, and galactic city urban model, as well as the Latin American and LDC urban zone models. By the end of the lesson, describe the concentric zone model, the sector zone model, and the multi-nuclei zone urban models. 2. Analyze how the three models help to explain where people live in urban areas, which is called a social area analysis. 3. Describe how the three models explain patterns in urban or European cities. 4. Describe how the three models explain patterns in cities in developing countries. 5th, explain why the galactic city model best explains urban development in the 21st century in the United States. And 6, describe the history of development of cities in developing countries. Again, when we look at the development of the central city, like we talked about yesterday, we know historically the central city of Chicago is going to be very important. And look with the conurbations or the suburban growth as we get, we see from 1870s, a small central city, 1900s, a larger central city, and by 1930, Chicago is a very large central city. A social area analysis is when we have an idea of where people live according to their ethnic background or socioeconomic status, and that helps us, again, understand the distribution of the variety of people. We use several different models. The three basic models are listed here: the concentric zone model, and the sector model, and the multi-nuclei model. Keep in mind these models really began when we started looking at land patterns in the 1920s and 30s. Those models generalized the varied urban universe and helped explain some regularities in city growth and structure. Most recently, urban geographers have begun to offer models that address newer patterns of the decentralized automobile city. So these models, minus the multi-nuclei model, predate automobiles. So the common starting point of the early models is the distinctive CBD, which we talked about yesterday, along either a railway line or along a river in the older central cities. The core of the CBD displays the intense land use, which we talked about yesterday in the bid-rent theory development, and already discussed the major shopping concentrations, tall office buildings, and streets crowded with pedestrians. Framing the core is a fringe area of warehousing, transportation terminals, and light industry. Just beyond the fringe is where we begin to see residents, which takes us to the concentric zone model. So this model was created by a sociologist in the 1920s. This model was analyzing the concentric zone rings of the growth of Chicago. So keep in mind, Chicago is a very flat land, and as they moved out, they had perfect isotropic land to measure these zones. Well, there are concentric rings that make up the model, and what he went on to say that you have in the first zone, you have the zone of transition, which is characterized by change and deterioration and contains warehouse and factories mixed with high density, low income slums. The next ring outward is where you have the workers' homes, or the zone of the working class. Homes are modest. They're the homes of the workers. They tend to be older and smaller. The third ring is better residence. These are single-family homes or higher rent apartments for those able to exercise choice in their housing location and afford a longer journey or transportation to and from the CBD as commuters. Finally, the last zone is the outer zone, the low-density suburban development, which is the outer part of the central city, but it's continuously built up, and over time, we'll begin to see, after the 1950s, the unincorporated suburbs. Here is a picture of the concentric zone model and the 5 rings. The next is the social area analysis of the concentric zone model. It tells us a lot about the newer houses. Tells us where the wealthy or the socioeconomic wealthier classes are. When we look at Houston, near the CBD, we see people that live in older houses, and then clearly with um, houses that were built after 2005 would be extending well outside the urban loop of Highway 8. So again, the social area analysis tells us where socioeconomic classes live within an urban area. It can also tell us the ethnic backgrounds because traditionally, let me go back, because traditionally, and we're not going to get into the history, we'll talk a little bit why we see ethnic groups found within central cities, but we can just understand that Jim Crow laws in many parts of the South didn't leave until the 1960s, and then we also know that with our ethnicity unit that African Americans moved from interregionally in the 1900s to the 1950s from the central city to aligning central city areas. So it also tells us the distribution of ethnic groups. All right, the concentric zone model does follow the bid rent theory, where we can see that cost of apartment buildings is high when you get into the zones of 1, 2, and 3. This would be today. Suburban family zones outside in the outer ring, less expensive the further you get out. So you get into the zone 4 or you get into the zone 5. So the commuter zone or the zone of better residence, you're going to see cheaper land, so more people would live. And that is where you'd see the middle income residents or the high income residents. All right, and then you see the CBD would be where manufacturing is in wholesale. And I take that back. This is prior to 1950, this model. So again, this is what a CBD would have looked like with the birth of suburbs in the 1950s. All right, the next is a sector model. All right, and the sector model was created by economist Humer Hoyt. Same city, Chicago, where he did his urban analysis. He did not use rings. Instead, he used his sectors. As a city grows, activities expand outward along edges or sectors from the center. The wealthy class lived along boulevards or lake shores or ridges or hills, desirable sites, and poorer classes lived near the polluted regions of industry and heavy transportation. As we can see here with the sector model, you can see that the sectors that are least desirable would be the transfer 2, and that's where typically you see, you can see the sector model in many cities today. That would be like I-94 through St. Paul, where Frogtown is, right along the highway system. Or think about wherever Martin Luther King Jr. boulevards are, they're always along highways where the zones of poor residents reside. And then the desirable zone is going to be the green zone, furthest away from industry and the polluting industrial factories. And then you can see middle class is found in zone 4, and that's found on both sides of transportation and sides of the CBD. The sector model is also really common of Latin America, and we'll talk about that later. All right, when we look at the sector model, we're looking at socioeconomic, much like the concentric zone, but now we can see even further where poorer residents are and where wealthier residents are with the sector zone model. And when we look at the high income, they do not live in the same sector of the city as we saw. In the previous slide, we can see right here as well that sector that moves along the 10, or just below the 10, would be the wealthy economic sector in Houston. All right, let's move on to the multinuclei model. The multinuclei model was created by geographer Harris and Ullman in 1945. And this is the start of the automobile, so they call it the automobile epoch or automobile era. Now we have um, the birth of the edge cities, which are nodes of consumer and business services around the beltway or the urban beltline, which I've talked about, and that's that typically of urban areas. It's a three number and around this interstate number that ends in an even number. So like 494, 694 is our urban beltline, which signifies the growth of edge cities. So we see the birth of edge cities. But what we see is that now there will be more nodes of economic activity where populations will cluster around, such as ports, airports, or ports of ships, or universities, or even parks. When we look at the multi-nuclei model here, we can see those different economic nodes for clusters of developments. And then we can also notice that industry moves out to the suburbs. So we know this is the car era of the CBD. It's not an old CBD. And manufacturing right again along that urban beltline or urban loop. And we can see also the high class is found on the outside in the birth of what are the suburbs outside that belt line. And then right inside that belt line, you would see the medium class, which would still be within the area of the central city. The multi-nuclei model tells us the distribution of ethnic and racial backgrounds. And we can see right here enclaves of both Hispanic and African Americans clustered in the central city of Houston. Meanwhile, outside the Beltline, you have the other groups, which are majority white and then disproportionately, but a high percentage of Asian. All right, so how can we use these models today? Yes, there are limitations, which we'll talk about, but they can be used. They're too simple, for one, to just use because urban areas have evolved so much, especially central business districts and central cities and unincorporated suburbs. But the concentric zone model, we can see where newer houses are, where older houses are. The newer houses tend to live outside that belt line, the urban belt line. And newer houses tend to be larger and occupy more land. Where when we move inside that belt line in most urban areas today, we can see older houses, smaller houses, houses closer together. Sector model, we can see where families, the different families that own houses or rent property, high incomes will own and they will live in the same sector. Low income will typically rent and they will live in the same sector, usually along transportation routes or pollution or less desirable land. Excuse me. And then multi-nuclei model. How does it apply today? We can see where different ethnic backgrounds are and clustered near different economic nodes. All right. Let's talk about the flaws. I mentioned they're too simple. We have contemporary urban patterns that have evolved with suburban sprawl. So we have the growth of edge cities, and we have the growth of the importance of consumer services well outside the beltline. So combining the models is the most helpful way to analyze an urban area. But we also when we talk about Borchards' automobile era, in the 1950s it's car, then the 1970s were airplanes. So when you have, and then in the 2000s now you're looking at mass transits. So that will definitely change how an urban area develops. But we did learn in our ethnic unit that people tend to live in enclaves with desirable characteristics. All right, now on to the Galactic City model. This is the most contemporary model that would be most applicable to our urban areas today. Well, when we think about major changes due to the automobile, really it happens after World War II, especially with conurbations or the suburbanization of the central city. And when we look at this map here, we can see the peripheral model focuses on um, the, the peripheral belt that lies within the metropolitan area, but outside the central city. You see um, you can see the edge cities, and then the CBD, and yep, and we can see expressways, and this and how it's outside the central city, and they go well outside expressways, well outside the central city. When we look at the Galactic City model, we will see large tracts of land available outside that, the urban loop. And here we have the King of Prussia Mall, which is the largest mall in the world, which is an economic pole. Um, but we see developments that are outside the urban loop, and you see homogeneous suburban clusters. Much of the life takes place, as we can see with these, outside of the central city with the Galactic City model. And then employment and outlining industrial office parks, which we can't see here, but we should see outside that urban loop, would be industrial parks. And then we see the emergence of new edge cities. So when we talk about the growth of edge cities, it's like Swiss cheese. There's huge pockets of land between these developments because they develop usually based on an economic node, service node. All right. All right, so how do we see the Galactic City model parking lots around stores and um, outside that urban loop, or what is known as an urban belt line? You'll see large shopping malls. You'll see them spread out, single-use zones. You'll see the development of conurbation, or which is urban sprawl, low office parks along major interstate roads. We'll see the continued built up of the suburbs in the 1980s, and especially nodes of mostly consumer services, but to less specialized business services moving into office parks in edge cities. And you'll see the importance of that belt line, as I already mentioned. You'll see the galaxies of economic activity, like we saw in the last photo. King of Prussia Mall in Philadelphia, the largest mall in the world, that will bring a lot of people to that economic activity center, and then other areas where they're bringing people to those outlining urban areas, business and consumer services, like Orange County, which is known as the South Coast Metro. Well, with the Galactic City model, we know there's decentralization, so it's a post-industrial economy. We know that most shopping, consumer services, and less specialized move to the suburbs. Jobs are found in the periphery, so there's going to be a density gradient, meaning that you see the flattening of land and the lower arithmetic density as you get further out. Cities, um, middle class will move out to the suburbs, lower class will stay in the central city. Population will continue to grow, where suburbs will have the largest percentage of population in the 1980s. But as we already saw, there's spread out, there's gaps within those developments, within the economic nodes of a galactic city. And suburbs will continue to grow, as, uh, as will the demand for activities and lifestyle. All right, quickly review the models. All right, that will end the lesson today. As always, go on to your conclusion write-ups.